In a quiet suburb on the edge of town, among old houses with peeling roofs and narrow streets that seemed to hold secrets of times gone by, lived Vera Ivanovna, an elderly woman with an elegant but discreet bearing. Every day, with a steady, patient pace, she walked down the street to the small grocery store, carrying a time-worn cloth bag. Despite her advanced age, Vera faced life with dignity and resolve. Even when the world around her seemed indifferent or even hostile, that day, the sun barely filtered through the grey clouds, casting a melancholy shadow over the scene. Vera, with her slow but determined stride, walked along the uneven sidewalk, oblivious to the group of teenagers watching her from afar. There were 4 of them, dressed in casual clothes and with an air of defiance that betrayed the boredom of an empty day. Their gazes met, and a mocking smirk appeared on the boys' faces. One of them, a thin boy with disheveled hair and a phone in his hand, broke the silence. "Hey, look at the old lady. Doesn't she look a little out of place?" he said, chuckling. The others followed him, adding sarcastic comments and cutting jokes, their voices bouncing off the walls of nearby houses. Vera, accustomed to such behavior, did not look up or show signs of being upset. Inside, however, a mixture of sadness and annoyance drove her to grip the handle of her bag tighter. She was tired of being the target of arrogant young men who knew neither respect nor compassion, and nevertheless, she decided to keep her composure. Arriving at a street corner, Vera stopped, pulled her cell phone out of her bag, and dialed a number. Her usually serene face now showed a determination that she rarely let show. "Luca, my son," she said, in a firm but calm voice. "I need your help. Someone is misbehaving here." On the other end of the line, her son's reassuring voice promptly replied, "Mum, don't worry, I'll take care of it." Vera ended the call and stood, waiting calmly. A slight breeze lifted the edges of her shawl, while the boys, unaware of what awaited them, continued to laugh. Vera stood motionless for a few moments after ending the call, the phone still clutched in her hand. The years had taught her not to react impulsively in the face of provocation, but that day, something inside her had broken. It was not so much about herself, but about the sense of impunity that shone through the looks on those boys' faces. It was a kind of arrogance she could no longer tolerate. Meanwhile, the group of teenagers continued to observe Vera with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. One of them, the tallest, leaned toward his classmates. "Who do you think she called? She certainly has no friends who can help her," he said with a raucous laugh. The others joined in his amusement, daring each other to see who would have the courage to come the closest. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Luke had risen from his desk with a serious expression. He worked in a special intervention team and was not used to receiving personal calls during working hours. But that day, the tone of his mother's voice had struck him like an electric shock. He knew Vera well enough to know that if she had called, it meant that something was really wrong. Without wasting any time, he contacted some of his colleagues on patrol. "There's a situation going on near the Central District. I need some help now." Returning to the sidewalk, Vera moved a few steps away, finding shelter under the shade of a nearby tree. She had an outward calm that confused the boys, but her heart was beating fast. It was not fear, it was anticipation of something he knew would come. The youngest of the group, a boy with a still childlike face, approached, hesitating slightly. "Mom, were you looking for someone?" he asked in a tone that oscillated between irony and uncertainty. Vera looked him directly in the eyes. "Yes, I'm waiting," she replied, her voice so quiet that it made the young man uncomfortable. The other boys burst out laughing, but he took a step back, confused by the woman's confidence. A few minutes later, the sound of an engine interrupted the heavy afternoon air. A black car stopped with a jolt a few meters from the group. 2 men in civilian clothes got out of the vehicle, followed by a third figure wearing a discreet uniform. The boys, who up to that moment had felt in control of the situation, stood motionless, as if time had frozen. Luke, the first to descend, approached his mother with confident steps. "Are you all right?" he asked her, his tone low but charged with tension. Vera nodded slowly, pointing to the boys with a slight movement of her head. "They did it," she said without raising her voice too much. The men turned toward the boys, who were now trying to mask their nervousness with expressions of false indifference. "So what's going on here?" asked one of the men in a firm but not aggressive tone. The group began murmuring half-hearted apologies, trying to downplay the situation. "We weren't doing anything, we were just joking," said one of them, but his tone betrayed insecurity. Luca crossed his arms, watching the boys with a piercing gaze. "These jokes usually don't end well," he said calmly, "and you guys are lucky that someone didn't lose his temper today." His presence and that of the other men had created an atmosphere of authority that the boys did not know how to deal with. Vera watched the scene with a mixture of relief and reflection. For years she had silently endured the small daily injustices, but now she understood that sometimes it was necessary to ask for help, not for revenge, but to restore a sense of justice, not only for herself but for anyone who had been the victim of similar behavior. After a brief dialogue with the boys, the men decided to take them away for a more serious confrontation. As they walked them to their car, one of the teenagers turned to Vera. His eyes filled with a mixture of anger and shame. She, however, kept her gaze calm, almost compassionate. "Maybe they'll learn something today," she thought, as Luca approached again. "Mom, let's go home," he said with a smile that hid concern. Vera nodded, clutching her son's arm as they started down the street. Behind them, the neighborhood seemed to return to its usual calm. But Vera knew that something had changed that day, not only for her, but also for those boys. On the ride home, Vera remained silent. Luca's arm, firm under hers, gave her a sense of protection she had not felt in years. However, thoughts crowded in her mind. It was not the first time she had been confronted with young people who used sarcasm as a shield to hide their insecurity. But that day had seemed different. It was as if that group was the epitome of a generation that knew neither empathy nor limits. "Are you okay, Mom?" asked Luca, interrupting her thoughts. The tone was concerned but also curious. It was unlike her to call him out on something so seemingly simple. Vera nodded slowly, then stopped and turned toward him. "You know, Luca," she began with a tired smile, "I realize that sometimes words are not enough. Those kids, I don't even think they realize the harm they're doing." Luca sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That's true," he replied, "but the problem is that there are no real consequences for them. They live in a world where everything is a joke, until they meet someone who forces them to think." His voice became firmer, almost as if he were talking to himself. Meanwhile, in the vehicle carrying the teens, the atmosphere was completely different. The four teenagers, sitting in silence, were trying to avoid the gaze of the two officers accompanying them. The youngest, the one who had tried to address Vera with apparent politeness, looked out the window, his face red with embarrassment. "What will happen now?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled slightly. One of the officers, a stout man with a scar across his left eyebrow, turned to him. "What's going to happen is that you're going to have a long conversation with someone who's going to make you realize that your fun day wasn't so fun for everyone," he replied, his voice calm but firm. Meanwhile, Vera and Luca reached the house. It was a small, modest dwelling with a garden that showed signs of loving care. Vera sat in the chair by the window, looking out at the yard. Luca took a seat across from her, his gaze fixed on his mother. "It's not fair that you have to go through these things," he said, almost in a whisper. "Not after all you've already gone through." Vera looked at him with a gentle but determined expression. "Luca, life is not always fair, but we cannot let injustice define us. What matters is how we respond." Her voice was calm, but there was a hidden strength in her words that struck Luca. He realized that, despite everything, his mother had found a way to keep her dignity intact. Meanwhile, at the local police station, the boys were taken to a room for a one-on-one interview. There they met the head of the division, a middle-aged man with a stern but not hostile air. "Do you have any idea why you are here?" he asked, staring each of them in the eyes. The boys lowered their eyes, murmuring evasive answers. "We weren't doing anything wrong," said one of them, trying to sound confident. The division leader leaned forward slightly. "Do you people think it is normal to laugh at an old woman? Do you think your behavior has no consequences? The reality is that your actions carry weight, and today you will see the results." That evening, Luca stayed at home with his mother. As they sipped a cup of tea, Vera shared with him some stories from her past. She talked about how she had faced far greater challenges during her youth, how she had learned to see the good side in people despite everything. "I don't want you to think I'm weak," he said, with a subtle smile. "Calling you was not a surrender. It was the best way to teach those kids a lesson. Luke looked at her with renewed respect. His mother, despite everything, was one of the strongest people he had ever known. He decided at that moment that he would do anything to protect her, not only physically but also from the sense of isolation that often accompanies old age. Meanwhile, the boys were released with a stern warning and the promise of future monitoring. As they left the police station, the air of superiority they had displayed earlier seemed to vanish. They exchanged nervous glances, aware that something in them had changed, although they were not yet ready to admit it. 2 days after the incident, Vera found herself again on her way to the grocery store. The neighborhood seemed quieter than usual, almost as if the boys' laughter and comments were just a bad memory. Yet as she walked, she could not ignore an uneasy feeling that had crept up inside her. Experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and that day was no exception. Arriving at the store, she greeted the saleswoman with her usual kind smile and began to select a few items from the shelves. But as she approached the cash register, she noticed something strange. Standing near the exit was one of the boys who had teased her a few days earlier. He had his eyes downcast and his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. He looked like a shadow of the arrogant person he had been. Vera watched him for a moment, uncertain whether to ignore him or confront him. But the boy, as if sensing her hesitation, stepped forward. "Mom," he began in an uncertain tone, "I'm sorry about what happened. I meant no disrespect." His words were sincere, but his face betrayed deep disquiet. Vera was surprised. She had not expected one of those boys to appear before her to apologize. "I appreciate your words," she replied calmly, "but I wonder, why are you here? Really?" The boy lowered his gaze, unable to answer immediately. After a few seconds, he raised his head and said, "There's something I have to tell you. All is not as it seems." The boy's tone had changed. It was no longer that of a simple apology, but of a confession. Vera remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "That night, after we were taken away, one of my friends said something that made me think. It wasn't the first time we did things like that, but we never asked ourselves who the person we were teasing really was. And when I heard that she had a working son, well, in certain circles, I started to worry." Vera stared at him, trying to understand the hidden meaning behind his words. "What are you trying to tell me?" she asked, maintaining a firm but gentle tone. The boy looked around, as if afraid of being overheard. "My friend, the one who seemed to be the leader of the group, he's not like the others. He has connections, and I think he's planning something. I don't know exactly what, but I think you and your son are involved." Vera's heart sped up. She wasn't sure if the boy was telling the truth or trying to scare her. But his voice, the way he avoided her direct gaze, seemed genuine. "Thank you for telling me," she replied, keeping her composure. "But I want you to know that I'm not easily intimidated." The boy nodded, then turned and left the store without another word. Vera stood motionless for a moment, her mind working frantically to put the pieces of that strange conversation together. She decided not to wait any longer and called Luca, telling him everything. On the other end of the line, her son listened attentively, his tone becoming increasingly serious. "Mom, I'll be home right away," he said. "I don't want to take any chances. If what that boy said is true, we have to be ready." Vera nodded, even though she knew Luca could not see her. "All right," she replied, "but I want you to know that I'm not afraid. I will not be bowed down by these threats." Meanwhile, Luca contacted some colleagues, explaining the situation. They decided to increase surveillance around Vera's house and keep an eye on the neighborhood. Although there was no concrete evidence, the idea that someone might try to target her mother or her family was enough to put them on alert. That evening, Vera sat by the window, watching the flickering lights of the neighborhood. The calm that had always defined her seemed to waver slightly, but inside she knew she would not let it overwhelm her. Luca arrived shortly thereafter, bringing with him a reassuring presence. "Don't worry, Mom," he said, taking a chair beside her. "Whatever is going on, you are not alone." But as they spoke, an unfamiliar car drove slowly past their house, stopping for a moment before driving off again. Vera and Luca exchanged a glance. There was no need for words. They both knew something was about to happen. Luca stood by the window, watching the now dark street. The car that had stopped in front of the house a few minutes earlier had disappeared, but the uneasiness it had left behind did not dissipate. "I don't think it was an accident," he said, turning to Vera. Someone wanted to be seen. Vera, sitting in her favorite chair, kept her composure. "We shouldn't jump to conclusions," she replied. "It could be a coincidence." However, the tone of her voice betrayed a subtle tension. Despite his indomitable spirit, he knew the situation was not to be underestimated. Luca made a quick phone call to his most trusted colleague, Marco, explaining the situation. "We need a patrol around my mother's house," he said firmly. "I don't want to risk it." On the other end of the line, Marco promptly replied, "We'll be there in 10 minutes. Stay there and keep us updated." Meanwhile, Vera began to reflect on the words of the boy she had met at the store. His face, the tone of his voice, the air of fear he had tried to conceal all indicated that he was telling the truth. But what did she mean by connections? And why would someone involve her in such a dangerous situation? Her mind went back to those distant days when she had worked as a nurse during a period of political conflict in the country. Could it be that something from her past had come back to haunt her? The ringing of the phone broke the silence. Luca answered immediately. It was Marco. "We noticed a suspicious car wandering around the neighborhood," he said. "We sent a team to check it out. But for now, stay inside the house and don't make any rash moves." Luca ended the call and turned to Vera. "They are checking it out, but I want you to be ready for anything. If anything happens, there are escape routes in the back." Vera nodded, but her gaze was steady. "I won't run away, Luca. This is my home. If anyone thinks they can come here and intimidate me, they will have to deal with me." Luca smiled slightly, appreciating his mother's determination. "I know, Mom, but let me take care of them." He took a flashlight and went out to the back of the house, checking for signs of intruders. The garden, with its manicured flower beds and small tool shed, looked peaceful. However, Luca knew that calm could be deceptive. As he checked the perimeter, Vera decided to take care of something that was nagging at her, the truth behind the connections the boy had mentioned. She picked up her phone and placed a call to an old friend, Elena, who was still working as an investigative journalist. "Elena," Vera began, "I need your help. There is something strange going on, and I think you are the only one who can help me understand." Elena listened carefully, noting down every detail. "Let me do some research," she said. "I'll call you back as soon as I find out anything." Vera thanked and ended the call, feeling a little more relieved knowing she had someone on her side. Meanwhile, Marco and his team had stopped the suspicious car. Inside were two men, both with questionable pasts and known ties to local criminal activity. When the officers questioned them, the two merely said they were looking for an address. "Just a mistake," they insisted, but their nervousness betrayed something more. News of the arrest soon reached Luca. Back in the house, he informed his mother. "They were not here by accident," he said. "They have a murky past, but for now we can't prove it. They were released with a warning, but they will be watched." Vera listened to him in silence, her gaze lost beyond the window. "They must know we are prepared," she said finally. "If they think they can intimidate us, they are wrong." That night, Vera struggled to sleep. Memories of the past kept surfacing, mingling with worries of the present. At dawn, Elena called her back. "I found something," said the reporter. "The boy you told me about, the one who seemed to be the leader of the group. He has connected to a family known for illicit activities. That's why he was so confident. But there's more. His father has a score to settle with someone who works in law enforcement. That could be why you were targeted." Vera was speechless for a moment. "Thank you, Elena," she finally said. "That changes everything." After ending the call, she turned to Luca, who was already making coffee. "I think something bigger than we imagined is involved," he said, "and we can't face it alone." Luca fixed his mother with a serious look. "Her score to settle with someone in law enforcement? Mom, that changes things. It's no longer just a matter of a few rude teenagers. We're talking about people who could be really dangerous." Vera nodded slowly. "I know that, Luca. But we can't let ourselves be intimidated. We have to act intelligently." The tone of her voice was calm, but the weight of the situation was evident in her gaze. Luca decided to contact Marco immediately to update him on the information provided by Elena. "We need to look into this," he said into the phone. "Who is this family, and what do they really want?" Marco confirmed that he would initiate a more thorough background check on the family, but he also warned him to be cautious. If these have ties to criminal activities, they may stop at nothing to achieve their goals. Meanwhile, Vera received an unexpected visit. The young man who had apologized at the store appeared at her door, visibly agitated. "Ma'am," he said, almost breathlessly, "I need to talk to you, it's important." Vera, surprised, let him in, while Luke watched the scene with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. The boy who introduced himself as Daniele began to tell a story that left Vera and Luca speechless. "My friend, Andrea, is not like us. His father has enormous influence in our neighborhood, and Andrea uses that power to do whatever he wants. But this time, he crossed the line. After what happened at the store, he said he wanted to teach someone a lesson. I thought he was just joking, but then I heard his father talking about you." Daniel paused, his breathing erratic. "They said they can't let someone like you think they can take them on. I don't know what that means, but I thought you should know." Luca stood up, his face serious. "Daniele, you are risking a lot by coming here to tell us. Why are you doing this?" The boy lowered his gaze. "Because I don't want to be like them. I've always let them drag me down. But this time I realized it's not right." Vera, touched by his words, put a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Daniele, and for that I am grateful. Now, though, you have to be careful. I don't want you to get into trouble." After Daniele left, Luca made a decision. "We can no longer sit still and wait. If they want to play dirty, we have to be one step ahead of them." He contacted Marco again, sharing the new details. Marco, after listening, proposed a plan: infiltrate Andrea's group to find out more about their movements. Luca, though reluctantly, agreed. "But we have to be careful. We can't expose ourselves too much." They decided to send a young undercover agent, someone who could blend in with the boys and gain their trust. Meanwhile, Vera continued to reflect on the past. Daniel's words had stirred up memories she had tried to bury. Years earlier, while working as a nurse, she had become involved in a sensitive situation involving a member of Andrea's family. She had reported medical irregularities that led to a major investigation. Although the case had been closed, it was clear that someone had not forgotten. That evening, as Luca and Marco discussed the details of the plan, Vera received another call from Elena. "I found out something interesting," the reporter said. "Andrea's father is involved in a big money laundering ring. But the most interesting thing is that some of his operations are related to a building project he is trying to approve in the neighborhood. And who is opposing this project? Senior residents like you. So it's a question of power," Vera concluded. "It's not just about a bill. They want to eliminate all resistance to carry out their plans." Elena nodded. "Exactly, and you have become a symbol for them, someone who must be neutralized." Vera ended the call and shared the information with Luca. "This is not just about us," she said. "It's about the whole community. We have to find a way to bring out the truth." Night fell over the neighborhood, enveloping it in a silence that seemed more ominous than reassuring. Vera, sitting by the window, watched the scattered lights of nearby homes. She felt that something bigger was about to happen, but she could not yet predict how it would all unfold. Thoughts overlapped in her mind as she thought back to Daniel's words and Elena's revelations. Luca, on the other hand, could not sit still. His training had taught him how to handle crisis situations, but this time was different. The threat was personal, and the risk to his mother troubled him deeply. "Mom, we have to act fast," he said, breaking the silence. "If we wait, we risk losing the advantage." Vera looked at him with a calm but determined expression. "Acting quickly does not mean acting without thinking. We have to be strategic, Luca. And we need to involve the right people." Her tone was firm, but there was also a note of hope. Vera had never been a woman to let circumstances bend her, and she would not start now. Meanwhile, Marco and his team had begun to gather information about Andrea's family. Thanks to a young undercover agent, they had managed to discover that Andrea's father, Stefano, had accelerated plans for his building project by intimidating residents who objected. But the real surprise came when the agent discovered a document that directly linked Stephen to a series of lawsuits against individuals who had tried to thwart his plans in the past. "It's not just about money," Marco told Luca during a call. "This guy is used to eliminating anyone who gets in his way, and he stops at nothing." The revelation increased Luca's concern, but it also increased his resolve. "I won't let him hurt my mother," he said firmly. "We have to expose him for what he is." Meanwhile, Vera received an unexpected visit. A group of elderly neighbors who had heard about the recent threats showed up at her door. "We know what's going on," said one of them, a petite woman but with eyes full of determination. "And we want to help you. This neighborhood is our home, and we won't let anyone destroy it." Vera, moved by the solidarity, let them in and listened to their stories. Each of them had faced intimidation and threats in the past, but none had ever had the courage to stand up to them. "Together we can make a difference," Vera said, "but we have to be ready for anything. This will not be easy." The discussion with neighbors had a profound impact on Vera. For the first time, she realized that the struggle was not just about her and Luca, but about the entire community. She decided to arrange a meeting with Elena to plan a strategy. "We can't just wait for them to make the next move," she told the neighbors. "We have to expose them publicly, with concrete evidence." As Vera and the neighbors worked to gather information, Daniele continued to provide crucial details about Stefano's network. The boy, though frightened, seemed determined to do the right thing. However, his involvement did not go unnoticed. One evening, on his way home, he noticed a car following him. His heart beat wildly, but he tried to keep calm. He decided to take an alternative route, hoping to lose his pursuers. Meanwhile, Eleanor had gathered enough evidence to link Stephen to a web of corruption involving not only the neighborhood but also local officials. "This is a bombshell," she told Vera during a meeting. "If we make this information public, we will not only stop his plans, we will put him out of business for good." Vera listened carefully, aware of the importance of that moment. "It has to be done the right way," she said. "We can't risk the evidence being invalidated or him finding a way to slip away." Eleanor nodded. "Leave that to me, but we have to be prepared for a backlash. Stefano will not give up easily." That night, as Vera pondered all that was happening, she received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was cold and threatening. "Stop meddling or you will pay the consequences." Vera ended the call without saying a word, but within herself she felt a new strength growing. "I will not be intimidated," she thought. "Not now, not ever." The next morning, the neighborhood seemed enveloped in a strange calm. Vera, despite the threat she had received the night before, woke up with an even stronger resolve. She decided not to share the phone call with Luca immediately. She did not want to distract him or make him act impulsively. However, the memory of that cold, threatening voice kept echoing in her mind. As she prepared her coffee, a soft knock on the door distracted her from her thoughts. She opened it slowly and found Eleanor, with an expression that mixed excitement and concern. "Vera," she said as she entered, "we have a problem. I just found out that Stefano knows we are investigating him. He has powerful friends and may try to stop us before we can do anything." Vera remained impassive. "We expected that, didn't we?" she replied. "We can't let his intimidation make us back down." Elena nodded, but she could not hide the urgency in her eyes. "Yes, but we must act quickly. If he can figure out who is helping us, like Daniel or your neighbors, he might hit them first." Meanwhile, Luca had spent the night monitoring the neighborhood with Marco and the surveillance team. During the shift, they had noticed an increase in suspicious activity. Cars slowing down in front of the homes of the residents most active against the housing project, and unknown men prowling the alleys. "They are trying to scare us," Marco said. "But they cannot know that we are watching their every move." That same morning, Daniel showed up again at Vera's house. He was agitated, and his face showed signs of fatigue. "Andrea knows I'm talking to you," he said almost in a whisper. "He told me that if I continue to betray him, his father will make sure that I and my family regret it." The fear in her eyes was palpable, but there was also a spark of courage. "I cannot go back and turn, but I need your help." Luca, who had just joined Vera and Elena, approached the boy. "Daniele, listen to me. You were incredibly brave to come here, but now we have to protect you. I can't let you take any more risks." Daniele looked at him with gratitude, but also with a sense of responsibility. "I don't want to run away," he said. "I want to do the right thing." Soon after, Elena shared a new piece of information she had discovered. "Stefano is arranging a secret meeting with some of his associates this evening," she said. "If we can record the conversation, we might get the definitive evidence to stop him." Luca nodded. "We definitely need to be there, but it will be risky. We have to plan every detail." Vera, who had remained silent up to that point, intervened. I will go with you. Luca looked at her surprised. Mum, I can't allow that. It's too dangerous. But Vera shook her head. I'm already in the crosshairs, Luca. And no one knows Stefano and his methods better than I do. I might notice something you wouldn't. Despite Luca's objections, Vera was adamant. In the end, they decided to include her in the plan. But, with precise security measures, Marco would place men in strategic positions around the meeting place, while Luca and Elena would follow Vera from a distance. That evening, Vera, her heart pounding but her face calm, approached the meeting place, an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the neighborhood. She entered slowly, trying not to attract attention. Stefano was already there, surrounded by several men who looked menacing. He was talking in a low voice to Andrea, his son, whose face showed an air of smugness. This neighborhood is ours, Stefano was saying. And no one, not even that old woman, can stop us. If necessary, we will use all means at our disposal to convince people to give in. Vera, hidden behind some crates, could hear every word clearly. Her blood was boiling, but she knew she had to remain calm. Meanwhile, Luke and Elena, who were monitoring the situation from outside, noticed something worrying. A group of armed men was approaching the warehouse. They are beefing up security, Luca whispered. We must act now. Marco, through an earpiece, gave the order to his team to get ready. The tension was palpable. Inside the warehouse, Stefano kept talking, unaware that everything was being recorded thanks to a small device hidden by Vera. But when one of the men noticed a suspicious movement, everything changed. "Who's there?" he shouted, approaching the crates. Vera stood motionless, holding her breath. At that moment, a side door swung open, and Marco with his team burst into the warehouse. "Freeze! Police!" he shouted. Chaos erupted. Stefano tried to escape but was quickly blocked. Andrea tried to resist, but Luca easily immobilized him. Vera, still hiding, came out only when everything calmed down. "You did a great job, Mom," Luca said, smiling. "We have everything we need." The arrest of Stephen and his associates spread quickly through the neighborhood like wildfire. The news reached every corner. The men who had intimidated residents for years had finally been exposed. Vera, returning home after the long night, sat in her armchair with a deep sigh. She was tired, but a sense of satisfaction and relief filled her heart. She had faced danger and, together with Luca and the others, had helped restore justice. Luca, sitting next to her, looked at his mother with respect and admiration. "I never thought I would say this," he began, "but you are an incredible fighter, Mom." Vera smiled weakly. "I'm not a fighter, Luca. I just did what was necessary. When it comes to protecting what you love, there is no other choice." Meanwhile, Marco was managing the chaos that followed the operation. Stephen, cornered, was desperately trying to negotiate, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Recordings made by Vera, combined with documents recovered by the undercover agent, painted a clear picture of his criminal activities. Bribery, intimidation, money laundering, all had come to light. Andrea, however, showed a different attitude. During the interrogation, he seemed more frightened than angry. "I didn't want to do it," he repeated. "It was my father. He got me involved." But his words were not enough to save his reputation. For years he had used his family's power to terrorize the neighborhood, and now he had to face the consequences. As police continued to gather evidence, neighbors began to gather in front of Vera's house. They brought flowers, sweets, and thank you notes. "We are here because of you," said an older woman, shaking Vera's hands. "You gave us the courage to fight." Daniel was one of the first to visit her. The boy, visibly relieved, looked like a different person than the one he had met only a few days earlier. "Madam, I don't know how to thank you," he said, looking at Vera with eyes full of gratitude. "You have given me a second chance. I will never forget that." Vera hugged him affectionately. "It was you who made the right choice," said Daniel. "Now use this opportunity to build something better." Eleanor, on the other hand, worked tirelessly to prepare a comprehensive report on Stephen's activities. "This story must not just end here," she told Vera during a brief visit. "It must serve as an example for other communities. People like Stephen thrive when people remain silent. Your story can inspire many to speak up." Vera nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "I just hope this all leads to something good," she replied. "I don't want anyone to have to go through what we went through." But as the community celebrated Stephen's fall, some shadows lingered. Mark received a warning from his contacts. Despite his arrest, some of Stephen's connections were still active and could seek revenge. When he discussed this with Luca, the latter decided to increase security measures around his mother's house. "Mum, we can't let our guard down," he said one evening. "Even if Stephen is out of the picture, it doesn't mean the danger is over." Vera listened to him carefully, but his response was surprisingly calm. "Luca, we cannot live in fear. I have learned that strength comes not only from physical protection, but from knowing that I am not alone. We have a strong community now. Together we can face anything." Her words touched Luca deeply. For years he had thought his role was to protect his mother, but now he understood that Vera was stronger than he had ever imagined. "You're right," he said, smiling, "but that doesn't mean I'm going to stop watching your back." Meanwhile, local authorities began to investigate how Stephen had managed to bribe so many people. The operation turned into a scandal involving politicians, businessmen, and even some prominent figures in the city. Every day new details emerged, and every day the community found new reasons to hope for change. One evening, Vera received a special invitation. The community wanted to hold an event to celebrate the courage and determination that had led to their victory. At first, Vera hesitated. She had never considered herself a heroine, just a woman who had done what was necessary, but she eventually agreed, knowing that the event was not just for her, but for all those who had fought alongside her. The day of the community-organized event was approaching, and the neighborhood was abuzz. Everyone wanted to contribute, some bringing food, some decorating the central square. For many it was a time to celebrate not only Stephen's downfall, but also the neighborhood's newfound unity. However, in Luke's heart, a shadow of worry lingered. Despite the celebrations, he knew that some threats were still latent. Meanwhile, Marco received a disturbing report. One of the men close to Stephen, who had not yet been arrested, had been seen near the neighborhood. He had a history of violence and personal vendettas, and was known to stop at nothing to protect his interests. Marco decided to warn Luca immediately. "I don't want to create panic," he said, "but I think we should increase surveillance, especially during the event." Luca agreed, but decided not to say anything to Vera for the time being. He knew his mother well enough to know that she would not want the festivities to be spoiled by additional fears. Nevertheless, she asked Marco to place plainclothes officers in the area, ready to intervene if there was trouble. As tensions grew, Vera focused on the event. Despite her modesty, she agreed to speak during the ceremony, aware of the importance of that moment. "I won't do it for myself," she told Elena during a talk. "I will do it for everyone who has been afraid to speak in the past. I want this to be a new beginning for our neighborhood." The night before the event, Daniele paid Vera a visit. The boy seemed more serene than in previous days, but there was still a note of concern in his gaze. "Mom, I wanted to tell you something," he began, hesitantly. "I know Andrea is no longer a direct threat, but there are other people working with her father, and not all of them have been caught. One of them sent me a message, saying that things are not over." Daniel's voice cracked slightly, but he continued, "I don't want to scare her, but I think we should be careful." Vera smiled sweetly at him. "Daniela, you were right to tell me, but we will not let these threats stop us. We have faced a lot, and we will face this too." On the morning of the event, the central square was bustling with activity. Stalls were set up, decorations hung, and the community gathered to celebrate their victory. Vera arrived accompanied by Luke, whose gaze constantly scanned his surroundings. Despite the festive crowd, he could not help but be vigilant. Halfway through the ceremony, Vera took the stage, greeted by warm applause. With a microphone in hand, she observed the crowd, taking a moment to savor the unity she had helped create. "Today, we are here not only to celebrate a victory," she began, "but to remind us all that together we are stronger. This neighborhood is not just a place where we live. It is our home, and it is our duty to protect it." His words resonated in the square, but Luke, who stood near the stage, noticed something unusual. At the back of the crowd, a man was moving suspiciously, avoiding the stares of the officers. Luca approached Marco, who was observing the scene from another angle. "Do you see him?" he asked, pointing at the man. Marco nodded. "Yes, he is one of the men we were looking for." Before they could act, the man began to move toward the stage, pushing the crowd hard. Vera, oblivious to the situation, continued her speech. "We must remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in spite of it," she said, her tone strong and decisive. Luke and Mark sprang into action, moving quickly through the crowd to intercept the man. When they reached him, they discovered that he was trying to hide something under his coat. "Stop!" shouted Marco, drawing the crowd's attention. The man, taken by surprise, tried to flee, but Luca blocked him with a decisive blow. During the scuffle, a gun fell to the ground, triggering a wave of panic among those present. Officers quickly intervened to calm the situation as Marco handcuffed the man. "It's over," Luca said, but his heart was still racing. He looked at his mother, who had been brought to safety by the other officers. Vera, though visibly shaken, still showed an impressive calm. When everything calmed down, Vera returned to the stage, against Luca's advice. "We will not let fear win," she told the crowd. "This event is not just a celebration, but a declaration. We will never be intimidated again." The applause that followed was even louder, and the community found new strength in that moment. But for Luke and Mark, they knew the battle was not yet over. The capture of the gunman during the event had shown that the danger was not yet over. Although the neighborhood had rallied around Vera with renewed determination, there was a shadow looming over everyone. The community had won a battle, but the war against the system of corruption and intimidation built by Stephen and his allies was still ongoing. That evening, as the square emptied and the lights were turned off, Marco summoned Luca and Vera to discuss the next step. "We have obtained a lot of evidence against Stephen," Marco said, pointing to a stack of documents and records. "But his men are desperately trying to cover their tracks. We cannot allow them to recover." Luca nodded, but his gaze was worried. "What if they attack again?" "I don't think they will stop here. They are desperate, and that makes them even more dangerous." Marco looked at him seriously. "You are right. That's why we have to get ahead of them. I have obtained authorization for a larger operation. We'll go straight to the source, the warehouse where they keep their documents and laundering money." Vera, who was listening attentively, intervened. "And what will happen to the community? If they find out we are acting against them, they may seek revenge." Marco reassured her. "We have intensified surveillance, and the capture of that man today sent a clear message. We will not tolerate any more threats." Meanwhile, Elena was preparing an explosive journalistic investigation, including evidence gathered during Stephen's arrest and the warehouse operation. "This story has to come out," she said aloud during a phone call with her editor. "We can't let these people remain in the shadows." But as the team prepared for the operation, an unexpected call came to Luca. It was Daniel. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice trembling. "I hear they are planning something big. They are gathering all the remaining resources for one last attempt. I don't know exactly what, but I've heard about an action against you." Luca realized that time was running out. "Where did you hear about them?" he asked. Daniel provided an address, an abandoned building in the suburbs, once used as a workshop. Luca immediately relayed the information to Marco, who decided to divide the resources. One team would check the workshop, while another would continue with the operation at the warehouse. The night turned into a race against time. Luke, accompanied by some officers, headed for the workshop, while Marco led the operation at the warehouse. Vera, against everyone's advice, insisted on staying at the team's temporary headquarters, monitoring developments. "I can't stay at home and worry," she said firmly. "I need to know what's going on." At the workshop, Luke and his team moved silently through the shadows. The building was silent, but there was something eerie in the air. When they entered, they found evidence of recent activity: open boxes, tools left out of place, and a smell of gasoline hovering in the air. "They're planning something," whispered one of the agents. But before they could investigate further, a sudden noise broke the silence. A back door swung open, and armed men burst into the room. A frantic struggle began. Luke and the team responded promptly, using their training to repel the attack. Stephen's men seemed determined to eliminate any threat, but the team held its ground. During the confrontation, Luca noticed that one of the men was trying to escape with a bag. He immediately realized that it must have contained something important. While Marco and his team at the warehouse retrieved incriminating documents and money, Luca chased the man out of the workshop. The night was cold, and the sound of footsteps echoed on the empty streets. After a close chase, Luca managed to pin him down in an alley. The bag fell to the ground, and when Luca opened it, he found a bundle of documents linking Stephen to corrupt public officials and other illegal activities. Meanwhile, back at headquarters, Vera received a real-time update from Marco. "We have everything," he said, "but Luca and his team are still at the workshop. They are facing tougher resistance than expected." Vera closed her eyes for a moment, silently praying for her son's safety. When Luke finally returned to headquarters, exhausted but whole, Vera greeted him with a hug. "You have done an incredible job," she said, her voice full of pride. "But we must prepare for what comes next. This battle is not over yet." With the evidence now in their possession, the team knew they had everything they needed to destroy Stephen's network for good. But they also knew that the last shots would be the hardest. Tension was at its highest, and everyone felt that the climax was approaching. The hours following the operation were hectic. With evidence gathered at the warehouse and workshop, the team finally had a complete picture of the activities of Stephen and his associates. Connections to corrupt public officials, money flows, and threats to the community were clearly documented. But Marco knew that the real challenge would be turning this evidence into decisive action. "Elena is preparing an explosive investigation," Marco said during a meeting with Luca and Vera. "If we can make it public before Stefano can react, we will nail him. But we have to move quickly. We can't give him time to fight back." Meanwhile, Vera reflected on the weight of the situation. Although they had made significant progress, she felt the danger had not yet passed. "Let's not underestimate Stephen," she said. "He has shown that he is willing to do anything to protect his power. We must expect one last move." And that move came sooner than they imagined. The following evening, as Elena was finishing editing her report, a group of armed men showed up at the newspaper's editorial office. Their goal was clear: destroy the evidence and silence Elena. However, thanks to a tip received from a contact within Stefano's network, Marco had already been informed of the plan. He and his team arrived just in time to intercept the men and prevent the attack. Tension peaked when a direct confrontation occurred in the newsroom. Stephen, who had personally shown up to oversee the operation, was blocked by Luke and Mark. "Did you really think you'd get away with it?" said Marco, pointing the gun at him. Stefano, though visibly nervous, maintained an air of arrogance. "You have no idea who you are playing with," he replied. "Even if you stop me, there will be others." But this time, Stephen had underestimated the group's determination. As Marco handcuffed him, Elena ensured that all the evidence was safe. "Your reign of terror is over," she said, looking at him with disdain. "And this time you won't be able to buy your way out." Meanwhile, Vera had remained at home, monitoring developments through a call with Luke. When she received confirmation of Stephen's arrest, a deep feeling of relief invaded her. But it was not a personal victory. It was a victory for the entire community. As Stefano was taken away, she tried one last attempt to intimidate Luca. "You are nothing without your mother," he said, with a venomous smirk. But Luca, keeping his composure, replied, "And it is because of her that you ended up here." With Stephen and his men finally in custody, a new phase began. Evidence was handed over to the authorities, and Elena's story was published, sparking a wave of public outrage. Corrupt officials were exposed, and Stephen's building project was officially halted. But what made this victory even more significant was the way the community responded. The neighborhood, which was once fragmented by fear, came together as never before. Residents began to work together to improve the area, organizing initiatives for the common good. Vera became a symbol of resilience, a figure respected by all. But she, humble as ever, continued to see herself as a woman who had simply done what was right. One day, while in the garden of her home, Daniel came to visit her. The boy, who had found a new job and was trying to rebuild his life, brought her a bouquet of flowers. "I wouldn't be here without her," he said, his eyes shining. Vera smiled. "Don't underestimate your strength, Daniel. It was you who chose to change." Elena also came to greet her, carrying a copy of the newspaper with the published report. "This is for you," she said, handing it to him. "Without your determination, this story would never have been told." Vera looked at the front page, which showed a picture of the neighborhood with the headline, "The Strength of Community, How Courage Defeated Corruption." She felt a mixture of pride and gratitude, not for herself, but for all those who had contributed to that achievement. However, Luke continued to maintain a silent vigilance. He knew that even if Stephen was out of the picture, there would always be people ready to exploit power for their own ends. But he also knew that with such a strong community and such a determined mother, nothing would be impossible. Here is the 12th development block, 800 words, where I conclude the story by resolving narrative arcs and setting the stage for a final reflection. With Stephen and his collaborators now in custody, the neighborhood began to breathe an air of renewed hope. The publication of Elena's report had triggered a domino effect. Authorities launched a broader investigation that led to further arrests and the removal of several corrupt officials. The community, which had been subjected to threats and abuse for years, finally felt free. Vera observed these changes with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. Visits from neighbors became more frequent, not only to thank her but also to share ideas on how to improve the neighborhood. One evening, during an impromptu meeting in her living room, someone suggested creating a committee of residents to watch for any future problems. "We cannot allow a situation like this to happen again," said an elderly gentleman. "We have to stick together." Everyone liked the idea, and Vera was elected as honorary chair of the committee. Although she initially hesitated to accept, the smiles and enthusiasm of her neighbors convinced her. "It's not for me," she said, "but for all of us. If we work together, we can do great things." Daniel, too, found his place in the community. The young man, who had once sought refuge in the arrogance of Andrea's group, now helped organize activities for the neighborhood kids. "I want them to have an alternative," he told Vera one day. "I don't want them to feel lost like I felt." Vera looked at him proudly. "You are an example to them, Daniele. Keep it up." Luke, who had lived in a constant state of alertness for weeks, began to relax. Although he was still alert, the end of the immediate threat allowed him to return his focus to his work and personal life. During one of his rare breaks, he sat with Vera in the backyard. "You know, Mom," he said, sipping tea, "I never imagined that all this would bring us here. You've shown a strength I didn't think possible." Vera smiled. "It's not strength, Luca. It's just the knowledge that sometimes you have to do what's right, even when it's hard." Then she added, in a joking tone, "And by the way, it's also thanks to you. I couldn't have done it without you." Meanwhile, Elena continued to work tirelessly. Thanks to her reporting, she received numerous awards, and her investigation became an example of courageous investigative journalism. But she never forgot to acknowledge Vera's role. "If it were not for your determination," he said during a ceremony, "this story would never have seen the light of day. You are the real heroine of this story." The neighborhood, transformed by the experience, began to flourish. Old rivalries were put aside, and residents began to work together to improve streets, parks, and common spaces. "This is just the beginning," Vera said during a committee meeting. "We have shown that we can tackle anything if we work together." But despite the positive mood, there were times when Vera reflected on the past. She thought about all the difficulties they had faced, the threats and dangers, and how it had all strengthened the community. One evening, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, she thought back to the words she had spoken during the event. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in spite of it. Those words now seemed truer to her than ever. One day, while walking through the neighborhood, Vera met a young mother with 2 small children. The woman stopped and greeted her with a smile. "Thank you for what you did," she said. "Thanks to you, I can now raise my children in a better place." Vera, moved, replied simply, "I didn't do it alone. It was a collective effort, but I am happy that we can look to the future with hope." Luke also found a new balance. Although he had always protected his mother, he now felt that Vera did not need him as much as he thought she did. Her strength and indomitable spirit had inspired him to be more open and confident. "You are a real rock," he told her one day, laughing. "But try not to put me in such stressful situations anymore, okay?" Vera laughed heartily. "I can't promise that, but I'll do my best." Overall, the affair left an indelible impression on everyone. Vera, with her calm determination, proved that even the most humble person can make a difference. Luke learned that strength lies not only in physical protection, but also in emotional support. and the neighborhood discovered the value of unity. Life in the neighborhood had regained a calmness it had never experienced before. Days flowed quietly, with children playing in parks and neighbors exchanging warm greetings as they passed each other on the street. But for Vera, every moment of this new serenity was a reminder of the long road they had traveled. One morning, as she was watering the flowers in her garden, she stopped to observe the vibrant colors of the petunias and daisies she had planted years earlier. Those plants, which had weathered the elements, were a symbol of the neighborhood's resilience. Sometimes you have to weather storms to really bloom, he thought, with a smile. Later, Luke arrived with a hot coffee and a copy of the local newspaper. "Look at this," he said, handing her the paper. The committee managed to get funding to renovate the old playground. Vera read the news carefully, her heart filled with pride. "It's amazing what we can do when we work together," she replied. "This neighborhood has become stronger than I ever imagined." Despite the successes, Vera knew there was still a long way to go. Corruption and greed had not disappeared from the world, but she had learned that true strength lies not in fighting alone, but in uniting and collective courage. "Every little change counts," he told Luke. And we did our part. Elena, who had never stopped working to tell similar stories, returned for a visit one afternoon. "I have received many letters since my reporting," she said, sitting next to Vera in the garden. "People from all over the country have written me to say they felt inspired by your story. Some want to set up committees in their neighborhoods. Others want to denounce similar situations." Vera, surprised, replied modestly, "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just did what I had to do." Elena smiled. "And that's exactly what makes you extraordinary." During one of the committee meetings, Vera took the floor to reflect on the future. "We cannot afford to be complacent," she said, looking at the faces of her neighbors. "We have shown that together we are strong, but we must continue to be vigilant. We must educate our children and grandchildren to respect others and never close our eyes to injustice." His words resonated deeply in the room, and the community pledged to continue that path of change. Daniel, now a respected young leader, made a personal commitment to organize educational activities for the neighborhood children. "I don't want them to grow up in the shadow of fear or corruption," he said. "I want them to have hope." That evening, Vera and Luca had dinner together, a habit they had rediscovered during those tumultuous weeks. "You know, Mom," Luca said as they cleared the table, "I've learned a lot from this. Not only about how to deal with danger, but also about what it means to be really strong." Vera smiled, wiping her hands. "Strength is not something you possess, Luca. It is something you build, step by step, with the people around you." She paused, looking into his eyes. "And you have always been my strength." As night enveloped the neighborhood, Vera sat by the window, watching the warm lights of the nearby houses. The shadows of the past finally seemed to be dissolving, making way for a brighter future. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a deep gratitude for what they had built together. This story is a testament to the power of community and individual courage. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, strength can be found in unity and the determination to never give up. If this story has inspired you, please consider how you can make a difference in your community. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that show the resilience of the human spirit. Share this story with anyone who needs a boost of hope and motivation. And remember, change starts with you. Until next time, and thank you for following along to the end.